America's forgotten invasions of Canada. When Americans think of wars, they often look overseas. Normandy, Vietnam, Iraq. But few realize that some of the earliest and most ambitious US invasions happened much closer to home. In fact, across the northern border lies a history of forgotten wars, failed expeditions, and uneasy peace. Moments when the United States tried more than once to make Canada part of its flag. This is the story of America's forgotten invasions of Canada. The first invasion came before the United States was even fully formed. In 1775, during the American Revolution, rebel forces decided that independence from Britain wasn't enough. They wanted to bring the northern colonies with them. The Continental Congress approved an invasion of Quebec, hoping French-speaking Canadians would join the rebellion. It was a bold plan built on bad assumptions. General Richard Montgomery led one army north from New York, while Benedict Arnold, yes, Arnold, led another through the Maine wilderness. The journey was brutal. Arnold's men trekked through freezing swamps, lost half their supplies, and nearly starved before even reaching Quebec City. When they finally arrived in December, they launched a desperate attack through a snowstorm. Montgomery was killed instantly, Arnold was wounded, and the ragged army retreated. Canada stayed loyal to Britain. The dream of a 14th colony died in the snow, but the idea didn't die with it. After the Revolution, many in Washington saw the northern border not as a limit, but as a challenge. Early American politicians believed it was natural for the entire continent to unite under one system. Benjamin Franklin called it inevitable that liberty should spread north. That belief, part ideology, part ambition, simmered for decades. By 1812, tensions between the United States and Britain were boiling again. Trade restrictions, British naval blockades, and impressment of sailors gave Congress a reason to declare war. But for many war hawks in Washington, the real prize was Canada. One congressman promised it would be a matter of marching. President James Madison quietly agreed. His private letters described Canada as ripe fruit ready to fall. The invasion began that summer with 3 American advances, through Detroit, Niagara, and Montreal. But the optimism collapsed almost immediately. In Detroit, General William Hull surrendered his entire army without firing a shot after being tricked by a smaller British and indigenous force led by General Isaac Brock and Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The bluff was genius. They lit extra campfires, shouted orders in multiple languages, and made their numbers seem far greater. The Americans panicked. Detroit fell in a single day. Further east, another U.S. force tried to cross the Niagara River at Queenston Heights. The assault was chaotic, but it produced one of Canada's most enduring legends. General Brock personally led a counterattack before being fatally shot. His troops rallied, driving the Americans back across the river. The invasion of 1812 ended the same way as 1775, with retreat, confusion, and snow. Still, the war raged for 2 more years. In 1813, U.S. forces finally captured York, modern-day Toronto, burning much of the town. The British retaliated by burning Washington the following year, including the White House. The War of 1812 ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 restored the old borders exactly as they were. Both sides claimed victory, but in truth, nothing had changed except the number of graves. Yet, America's invasions of Canada didn't end there. In the decades after the War of 1812, a strange new movement emerged from across the border, one that would bring fighting back to Canadian soil. Its name was the Fenian Brotherhood, made up of Irish immigrants living in the United States. The Fenians were veterans of the American Civil War who wanted to strike at Britain by attacking its closest colony, Canada. Between 1866 and 1871, they launched a series of cross-border raids that historians later described as the most determined amateur invasions in history. Their first target was the Niagara frontier. In June 1866, hundreds of Irish-American soldiers crossed the river from Buffalo, New York, and captured the Canadian town of Fort Erie. They even raised their own flag and issued proclamations of independence. But the victory didn't last. British regulars and Canadian volunteers regrouped, clashing with the invaders at Ridgeway. After a brief battle, the Fenians retreated back across the border, where U.S. authorities promptly arrested them. Undeterred, they tried again. Over the next few years, small groups launched attacks from Vermont and Maine into Quebec and New Brunswick. None succeeded, but their raids had an unexpected consequence. They scared the Canadian colonies into unity. The fear of invasion became one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Canadian Confederation in 1867. In a strange twist of fate, attempts to conquer Canada only made it stronger. While the Fenian movement faded, the dream of continental expansion did not. The idea of manifest manifest destiny. The belief that the US was destined to control all of North America became popular in the mid-19th century. Newspapers called Canada unfinished business. Politicians speculated about peaceful annexation through trade, but Canada's loyalty to Britain and its growing identity as a separate nation made that impossible. The border had hardened, but ambition hadn't vanished. One of the lesser-known episodes came during the American Civil War. With the Union and Confederacy locked in battle, Canadian territory became a playground for espionage. Confederate agents used Montreal and Toronto as safe havens, launching raids across the border into Vermont and New York. The US accused British Canadian officials of looking the other way. For a brief moment, some feared that another war, this time between the US and Britain, might erupt over Canadian neutrality. It didn't, but the distrust lingered for years. Even after peace returned, tension along the border remained high. In the late 19th century, disputes over fishing rights and territory flared repeatedly. The most famous was the Alaska boundary dispute, where both nations claimed the same stretch of coastline. It took an international tribunal in 1903 to finally settle it. Ironically, the British judge voted in favor of the United States, a decision that angered Canadians and reminded them just how fragile their sovereignty still was. By the early 20th century, Canada had transformed from a colonial outpost into a nation of its own, but the border remained a symbol of unease. American newspapers often referred to Canada as the northern frontier, and military planners on both sides quietly drew up defense maps. During both World Wars, Canadian troops fought alongside the British, not the Americans, yet their proximity ensured constant cooperation and quiet suspicion in equal measure. The irony of history is that while early America dreamed of conquering Canada, the two nations would eventually become allies. The same rivers where soldiers once traded musket fire would later host bridges of commerce. The longest undefended border in the world was once one of the most contested. Today, almost no one remembers that the United States invaded its northern neighbor multiple times. The wars that defined early North America, and from Quebec in 775 to Ridgeway in 1866, shaped the modern relationship between the two nations. The invasions failed militarily, but they succeeded in forging identities. For the US, it was a lesson in limits. For Canada, it was a test of endurance. If those campaigns had succeeded, the map of North America would look entirely different. There would be no Canadian flag, no Ottawa, perhaps not even the word Canada at all. The northern border would have vanished into a single continental nation, a dream that ended not with a treaty, but with failure on frozen fields and forgotten battlefields. The story of America's forgotten invasions of Canada is more than a tale of soldiers and skirmishes. It's a story about ambition meeting resistance, about how geography shapes destiny, and how nations are sometimes defined by the wars they don't win. Each invasion left behind scars and stories, from Detroit's surrender to the Fenian raids, reminders that history's borders are written in both courage and regret. What began as an attempt to unite a continent ended up creating two distinct nations that now stand side by side. The old battlefields have become parks and towns. The forts have turned into museums. The cannon smoke has faded, but the echoes of those forgotten invasions still linger along the quiet lakes and rivers that once divided empires.